You're not imagining it. The war isn't waged with tanks, guns, or bombs anymore. It's quieter, now subtler. It's in the pauses between words, the compliments that make you feel smaller, the freedom that somehow traps you. This is psychological warfare, and it's not a distant military term anymore. It's embedded into how we interact, obey, resist, and even love. You're told you're safe, free, and rational, yet your thoughts aren't always your own. Your actions often shaped by forces you don't see. And what makes it all so effective is its camouflage. It looks like kindness, feels like comfort, sounds like progress. But deep beneath, it twists your instincts, reprograms your patterns, and rewards your compliance in ways that slowly rob you of autonomy. This isn't about conspiracy or paranoia. It's about patterns that have always been there, woven into society, relationships, education, politics, advertising, and identity itself. Psychological warfare in plain sight doesn't raise alarms. It raises expectations. It teaches you to conform, to perform, to apologize for things you never did, and to feel guilty for asking questions. You think you're deciding freely, but how much of that decision was polluted with emotional manipulation, implied threats, or invisible scripts you never realized you were reading from? In this video, we're going to explore 25 paradoxes mind traps, so twisted they feel like freedom while binding you tighter. You won't find monsters here, just perfectly polite. Manipulations, weaponized empathy, and invisible power dynamics that pass as everyday life. Each paradox will peel back a layer of the human psyche where logic breaks, where emotion takes control, and where control hides behind a smile. These aren't riddles to solve. They're mirrors to stare into, and once you see them, it becomes impossible to unsee them. So sit back, breathe deep, and prepare to question everything that ever felt normal. It starts with something warm, a favor, a gesture, a compliment that feels too generous to question. Someone offers you help without being asked. They smile while they do it. They say it's nothing, but deep down, you feel a subtle shift, a tension you can't name. It's almost like the kindness came with invisible strings attached, even though no one said so out loud. You tell yourself you're just being ungrateful, but you're not. You're sensing the paradox. When kindness becomes control, this isn't about villainy in disguise. It's about how power often dresses itself as virtue. You see it in relationships, where one person always gives, always sacrifices, until the other feels indebted, not loved. You see it in workplaces, where a boss gives you flexibility, while subtly expecting you to always be available. You see it in family dynamics when parents remind their children of everything they've done for them. Not to uplift, but to guilt. That's the secret of weaponized kindness. It doesn't demand obedience. It seduces it. Because when someone appears overwhelmingly generous, it creates an unspoken rule you owe them. And suddenly you're making decisions not out of freedom, but out of fear of disappointing the person who was so good to you. You don't want to seem selfish. You don't want to be the one who says no to the saint. This is where psychological warfare hides in plain sight. It doesn't look like dominance. It looks like nurturing. But the effects of the same loss of agency, chronic guilt, identity erosion. People who control through kindness rarely raise their voice. They don't have to. Your own conscience becomes their loudest weapon. The psychology behind this is well documented. Social psychologists call it the norm of reciprocity, a deeply ingrained human instinct to return favors. But when that instinct is manipulated, it becomes a leash. And the more you obey, the tighter it gets. You start rearranging your priorities around someone else's generosity. You hesitate to speak up. You suppress resentment. And worst of all, you thank them for it. In abusive relationships, this dynamic becomes especially dangerous. The abuser may alternate cruelty with affection, punishment with gifts. After every wound, they offer a bandage. And the bandage is always too generous, too touching, too emotionally potent to resist. So the victim stays not out of love, but out of psychological debt. How could I leave someone who's done so? Much for me. They whispered to themselves, not realizing the cycle was designed that way. But this tactic doesn't just live in toxic relationships. It thrives in institutions too. A government grants you aid. With surveillance, a corporation gives you free services in exchange for your data. A religious figure offers salvation on the condition of complete obedience. It's all draped in the robes of goodness. And that's why it works. Over time, this dynamic rewires your inner dialogue. You start evaluating your own worth by how grateful you feel. You start distrusting your discomfort. They're being so nice. You tell yourself, why do I feel so trapped? That dissonance is the battlefield. There's no threat, no raised voice, no obvious command. Just stillness, a stare, a message left unread, a room that suddenly goes quiet after you speak. At first, it feels like nothing, but then it starts to crawl under your skin. You begin to feel responsible. You replay what you said. You begin filling in the blanks that were never voiced, and without a single word, you find yourself changing your behavior, apologizing, explaining, pleading for harmony that no one directly asked for. This is the paradox where silence forces action. We're taught to fear conflict that's loud, arguments, yelling, anger. But the most disorienting, psychological warfare often speaks with absence, not presence. A strategic silence can say more than any scream ever could. It creates a vacuum, and as humans, we're wired to fill it. Because silence doesn't feel neutral when it follows intensity. It feels loaded. It becomes a pressure cooker without steam. In relationships. This is the classic weapon of emotional withdrawal. One person goes silent, not because they need space, but because they know the other person can't handle the quiet. The silence becomes a tool of power. You figure out what you did wrong. You fix it, you make the move. The silence frames you as the problem, even if no accusation was made. And that's the genius of it. It lets guilt bloom in the soil of uncertainty. Psychologists call this demand withdraw behavior, where one person expects change but refuses to articulate what they want. It puts the burden entirely on the other. The silence is never framed as avoidance. It's framed as your failure to understand, to anticipate, to solve. This tactic is common in toxic workplaces. A supervisor who gives no feedback but demotes you later. A colleague who stops inviting you into conversations but never says why. The silence becomes social exile. And instead of confronting it, most people overcorrect. They work harder. They apologize for things they never agreed were wrong. They chase clarity that is purposely withheld. Why? Because silence in social groups activates our deepest fear, rejection, not being screamed at, being ignored. Even in parenting, silence is often used as a tool for control. A parent may withdraw affection, approval, or communication to punish a child without saying a word. It teaches that love is conditional on performance, on behavior, on compliance, and that's a lesson that sticks for life. That silence means danger, that it's your job to fix it, even when you don't know how. Silence also appears in global power games. Governments use silence to deny wrongdoing. Corporations use it to avoid accountability. Institutions delay responses. You're told to trust. It's the foundation of love, of teams, of families, of nations. Trust builds bridges. Trust creates unity. Trust is what makes relationships strong, society stable, and progress possible. But here's the trap they never warn you about. The deeper the trust, the more terrifying the betrayal. And the more you trust, the more you begin to doubt not just others, but yourself. This is the paradox. Trust breeds doubt. It doesn't begin with suspicion. It begins with warmth, with opening your heart, your secrets, your vulnerabilities to someone who says, you can count on me, and you believe them. You want to believe them because life without trust is unbearable. It's cold, lonely, paranoid. So you let someone in, you give them the key to your mind, and for a while it feels like freedom. But then one day, something small doesn't add up. A strange delay, a tone shift, a word that contradicts what was said before. Nothing major, just enough to make your stomach tighten. You try to brush it off. You tell yourself, I'm overthinking. After all, this person is trustworthy, right? You've trusted them for so long. So why does it feel like your trust is now the very thing making you anxious? Because trust isn't static. It amplifies risk. The more you trust someone, the more it costs to be wrong. That's the loop. That's why doubt starts to creep in, not despite the trust, but because of it. The higher the pedestal you place someone on, the longer the fall if they disappoint. You, and your mind knows that, it starts running simulations. What if I've misjudged them? What if they've been lying all along? What if I'm blind? That doubt festers because the stakes are too high. And instead of confronting the possibility of betrayal, most people turn the doubt inward. You start blaming yourself. You convince yourself you're broken for feeling suspicious. You gaslight your own intuition to protect the illusion of safety. And that's the most dangerous form of manipulation, self-manipulation born from trust. This is how abusers hide in plain sight. They earn your trust first. They become your safe space, your anchor. Then, when the mistreatment begins, it's subtle, just small enough that your trust overrules your instinct. You make excuses for them. They're just stressed. I'm probably being too sensitive. You double down a trust because the alternative betrayal is too painful to face, and the cycle grows. You stop trusting your doubts. You become more committed to the idea of the person than the reality of their action. You pledge yourself to a person, a cause, a code. You say the words with pride. I'm loyal. It feels noble, grounding, even heroic. In a world full of betrayal and chaos, loyalty is a compass, a way to declare who you are, what you stand for, and who you'll never abandon. But buried inside this shining virtue is a dangerous contradiction. The deeper your loyalty, the less room you have to change, question, or walk away. Loyalty undermines freedom, not because loyalty is inherently bad, but because of how easily it mutates into obligation. What starts as a voluntary bond becomes a silent contract. Over time, you stop asking if what you're loyal to still deserves it. You don't examine the values anymore. You protect them blindly. You don't consider your own growth. You suppress it. Because freedom requires the ability to choose again. And loyalty punishes that. You see this paradox play out in relationships first. Two people start with mutual love and choice, but years pass. Habits form. Expectations grow. And suddenly, you're no longer staying because it's right. You're staying because you promised you would, even when it hurts. Even when you're shrinking. Even when the other person stopped earning your presence long ago, you tell yourself, I can't leave, I'm loyal. But deep down, you know the truth. You're not free anymore. Loyalty is beautiful when both parties uphold their end. But it becomes psychological warfare when used to suppress change. It's the weapon used to silence doubts, to guilt you out of boundaries, to frame growth as betrayal. After all I've done for you, they'll say, you owe me. And just like that, your loyalty becomes a leash dot in institutions. It's even more insidious. Companies praise loyal employees, not because they value them, but because it means they can exploit them longer. Soldiers are told to die for flags. Citizens are told to trust their governments unconditionally. Loyalty becomes a trap dressed as patriotism. Dissent becomes treason. Independence becomes selfishness. And the price of staying loyal becomes your personal voice. The psychology here is subtle but powerful. We all have a need for belonging. Loyalty fulfills that. It gives us identity, but identity, when too rigid, becomes a prison. You stop evaluating ideas on their merit. You defend them because they're yours. Or worse, because someone once gave you something, and now you're bound to protect them. At first, obedience feels simple, safe. There's a rule, you follow it. There's an order, you comply. You tell yourself it's the right thing to do. You avoid punishment. You gain approval. You fit in, whether it's in school, at work, in religion, or society. Obedience is framed as virtue. It's called discipline, respect, order. But inside that polished idea, something quietly begins to grow. Resentment, resistance, a flicker of rebellion. Obedience fuels rebellion, not immediately. At first, obedience seems easier than thinking for yourself. You're praised for following. Instructions, for coloring inside the lines, for doing what's expected. But over time, the expectations don't stop. They tighten. The rules multiply. The freedom shrinks. And before you know it, obedience isn't just a choice. It's your identity. That's where the paradox begins. Because no human being can survive long in a state of complete compliance. Something in you, no matter how deeply buried, will push back. And the longer that push is suppressed, the more violent it becomes when it finally surfaces. Psychology proves this. Studies like the Milgram experiment showed how ordinary people obeyed authority figures even when it meant causing harm. But many of those same participants showed signs of inner conflict, trembling, sweating, protesting, because deep down, their conscience was rebelling against the very thing they were doing. This rebellion doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it simmers in passive ways. An employee stops caring. A student zones out. A child learns to lie just to avoid conflict. These aren't failures of morality. They're signals that the system of obedience has crushed autonomy so hard. The psyche has begun to leak around the edges. You can't lock up the human spirit without paying a price. Even in the most authoritarian regimes, rebellion doesn't vanish. It waits. It adapts. It becomes art, satire, sabotage. It hides in whispers and underground music and coded language. It becomes a heartbeat of defiance that never quite goes silent. And ironically, the harsher the obedience enforced, the more inevitable the rebellion becomes. This is why revolutions happen, not because people are wild, but because they've been forced to behave for too long. It feels good, doesn't it? The compliment, the applause, the affirmation that you're doing everything right. You glow a little brighter, you stand a little taller. Because praise is fuel. It tells you you're valuable, seen, accepted. But that's where the trap begins. Because sometimes praise isn't a reward. It's a leash. And the more you crave it, the easier you are to lead. Praise conceals manipulation. Not all praise is pure. Some of it is crafted, sharpened, a tool designed to guide your behavior in a specific direction. It's not about celebrating who you are. It's about reinforcing who they want you to be. You won't know it's happening at first. It feels too good. That's the genius of it. You don't resist praise. You absorb it. You internalize it. And slowly it starts to shape you. This is how children are trained. You're such a good girl when you're quiet. You're so smart when you agree with me. The message beneath the praise is clear. Be this version of yourself and you'll be loved. Be anything else and the praise will vanish. The child learns quickly, not how to be themselves, but how to perform for approval. In adult relationships, the same pattern plays out. A partner praises you specifically when you're submissive. When you abandon your boundaries, when you agree without question, it's not always verbal. Sometimes it's just a smile, a tone, a moment of warmth after a period of cold distance. The praise becomes the only light in a room you didn't realize was dimming. You follow it blindly. And here's the paradox. The more praise you receive, the less likely you are to notice the manipulation behind it. Because praise feels like love, and love disarms logic. You stop questioning motives. You start chasing that high again and again, working harder, sacrificing more, just to feel good again. Not for yourself. For them, this tactic is especially common in workplaces. A manager calls you the most reliable team player when you stay late without complaint. They celebrate your loyalty when you take on more than your fair share. And without ever asking, they get your compliance. You mistake it for recognition. But what they're really doing is setting the rules for how you earn value, overextend, overgive, overwrite your limits. In psychology, this is a classic case of positive reinforcement, but twisted. It's behavioral training disguised as admiration. And like all conditioning, they say they're helping. They use gentle words. They offer advice, step in when you struggle, wrap concern around every gesture. It feels supportive at first. You're grateful. And you let your guard down. But as time passes, something shifts. Their help doesn't empower you. It weakens you. You become dependent, confused, even ashamed. And yet you keep accepting it because saying no feels like betrayal. That's the paradox. Help hides harm. This kind of harm is quiet. It doesn't come with bruises or threats. It comes with assistance, kind gestures, overprotection disguised as love. You don't notice the damage right away because the harm isn't direct. It's what their help prevents you from becoming. Strong, independent, capable. Free. It's how the overbearing parent operates. They say, I'm just looking out for you. But what they're really doing is steering your decisions, undermining your instincts, and slowly replacing your autonomy with their comfort. Every choice you make is questioned. Every risk you take is discouraged. They handle things for your own good. And then one day, you realize you don't know how to make a decision without them. In relationships. It looks like caretaking with strings attached. A partner steps in constantly, not because you ask, but because they want to stay necessary. They solve your problems before you can try. They're always there, but only if you let them be in control. And soon their help becomes a currency, one you're expected to repay with compliance. This is especially dangerous when paired with guilt. If you reject their help, you're ungrateful. If you question it, you're selfish. If you try to grow beyond it, you're leaving behind the person who supported you. That guilt keeps you frozen dependent on a support system that doesn't want you to stand on your own. This dynamic shows up in systems too. A government that offers aid, but only if you conform. A corporation that supports your career, but expects total loyalty. An organization that provides resources, but silences dissent. The help is never truly free. There's always a quiet trade. Independence for protection. Voice for stability. Psychologists call this enmeshment, a pattern where boundaries are blurred and dependency is mistaken for love. The helper feels powerful. The helped feels. Fear is supposed to protect you. It tells you when to run, when to hide, when to stay quiet. It sharpens your instincts. It keeps you alive. But over time, it does something else, something far more subtle. It begins to train you. It rewards your obedience. It punishes your defiance. And before you realize what's happening, you're not avoiding danger anymore. You're avoiding disappointment, disapproval, rejection. You've become submissive not because you're weak, but because you're conditioned. This is the paradox. Fear rewards submission. It starts with one moment. Maybe you spoke your truth and got punished for it. Maybe you stepped out of line and someone you cared about turned cold. Maybe you tried to be brave and the world laughed. It doesn't take much. One sting is enough to make the brain remember. The next time you approach the same situation, fear steps in, not as a guardian, but as a guide. Play it safe, it whispers. Don't make the same mistake again. And when you obey, what happens? You're left alone. You're not criticized. No one's angry. You survived. That relief you feel, that's the reward. That's the dopamine hit for staying small. And the mind, eager to avoid discomfort, begins to link submission with safety. It's not just you. It's human psychology. The brain loves patterns. If doing less gets punished and staying quiet gets rewarded, then you will begin to shrink yourself by reflex. Not because you want to, but because fear has taught you that being fully visible is dangerous. This is how systems of power maintain themselves. They don't always need violence. They just need consequences. A slight demotion, a public correction, a cold shoulder. Enough to make you think twice next time. Enough to teach others watching. This is what happens when you speak up. And so you stop. In families, this shows up as emotional punishment. You express anger, and suddenly your parents withdraw love. You set a boundary, and they act like you've betrayed them. You do what they want, and harmony returns. Over time, you become an expert at reading emotional weather. You learn to obey not because you agree, but because fear has trained you. To keep the peace, in romantic relationships, submission becomes emotional survival. You don't bring up certain topics. You avoid asking for more. You tiptoe. You censor your needs before they become conflict. And when your partner smiles, doesn't explode. You're told freedom is the absence of chains. The right to choose, the ability to live on your own terms. It's the dream, isn't it? The pinnacle of independence. But what no one tells you is how often freedom comes with an invisible contract rules. You must follow systems you must maintain, beliefs you must never question. And if you do, the freedom you were promised begins to vanish. That's the paradox. Freedom demands obedience. This isn't the kind of obedience enforced by threats. It's softer, smoother, more elegant in its illusion. You're told you're free, and technically you are, but only if you behave in certain ways. Only if you speak the right language, hold the right opinions, buy the right things, think the right thoughts. Freedom, it turns out, has a dress code. And if you show up wearing the wrong mindset, you'll find the exit quicker than the entrance. You see it in democracies. You can say what you want until it threatens the status quo. You can live how you choose until your choices disrupt comfort. You can protest until your voice becomes inconvenient. And then suddenly, the freedom you thought you had becomes conditional, provisional, fragile. This is how societies maintain order without appearing authoritarian. They don't chain your body, they chain your sense of possibility. And they do it through psychological warfare disguised as freedom. You're taught that the rules are your safety, that obedience is your responsibility as a free citizen. And so, to keep your freedom, you learn to self-regulate. You silence your own rebellion. This paradox lives in families too. A child grows up hearing, you're free to become whoever you want. But when they choose something different, an identity, a belief, a path that doesn't align, the love becomes colder, the silence stretches, the disappointment thickens. The message becomes clear. Freedom is allowed, but only if you obey their family's unspoken rules. In relationships, this dynamic is just as alive. Partners say, be yourself, but withdraw emotionally the moment that self is inconvenient. The person who once celebrated your independence now subtly rewards you when you conform, and punishes you when you assert your needs. You stay free, as love is supposed to liberate you. That's what they say. It's supposed to make you feel whole, seen, safe, and often it does. In the beginning, but as the bond deepens, something else quietly takes root. A fear of loss, a shift in power, a quiet tethering of identity to another person. What began as connection becomes dependence. And the more you love, the more freedom you lose. That's the paradox. Love enforces dependence. Not all love, of course. But the kind we're taught to chase, the kind that makes someone else your everything, your reason, your anchor, your mirror. You begin to use their presence as proof of your own worth. You feel complete in their eyes, which means without their eyes, you're incomplete. That's when love stops being a choice and starts being a necessity, a psychological drug, one you can't afford to lose. This is where dependence begins, not with control, but with comfort, with gestures of affection that slowly become expectations. You used to enjoy their company. Now you need it. You used to feel better with them around. Now you feel anxious without them. And what makes it worse is that the relationship still looks healthy on the surface, because no one questions love. Love is sacred. Love is good. Love is supposed to hurt, right? Wrong. That's the illusion. Love, when pure, amplifies freedom. But when laced with dependency, it becomes emotional captivity. You don't speak your truth because you don't want to scare them off. You stop. taking risks because you don't want to rock the relationship. You adjust your dreams, your voice, your needs to keep things good. And each time you do, you lose a small part of yourself. While calling it devotion, dependence is clever. Like that. It wraps itself in romantic language. I can't live without you. You're my whole world. You complete me. These phrases are celebrated in movies and songs. But what they really signal is imbalance one soul shrinking into the shadow of another. This dynamic is especially dangerous when the other person realizes the power they now hold. Not always consciously. But over time, they begin to sense that your fear of losing them is stronger than your willingness to walk. You've earned this? The comfort, the ease, the routine that demands nothing from you but repetition. No more struggle, no more danger, no more surprises. You finally feel safe, stable, and yet something feels dull. You stop reaching. Stop. Stretching. The fire that once drove you begins to flicker. Not because you're tired, but because comfort has replaced purpose. That's the paradox. Comfort weakens willpower, that it doesn't announce itself. It slides in quietly disguised as peace, and to be fair, comfort isn't evil. We all crave it, after pain, after chaos, after effort. It's the reward, the cushion, the rest we deserve. But here's the trap. When comfort becomes permanent, it stops being healing and starts being numbing. Your goals begin to soften. Your urgency dissolves. That project you once burned to finish, it can wait. That boundary you were ready to set, maybe next time. That version of you that once wanted more. You tuck it away gently, like putting a restless child to sleep. It's not that you forget who you are. You just stop needing to prove it. And slowly your willpower, the engine behind your dreams, grows quiet. Because comfort doesn't just quiet the noise of the outside world. It quiets the drive to change it. You see this in people who have made it. The hunger that got them there fades. The routines calcify. The same meals. The same conversations. The same thoughts on repeat. They're not unhappy, but they're not alive either. They've traded the discomfort of growth for the predictability of comfort. And every time life asks them to evolve, they flinch. Psychologists refer to this as homeostasis, the body and mind's preference for stable internal conditions. It's why change feels hard, even when it's good for you. The brain is wired to conserve energy, avoid risk, stay in the known. And comfort becomes the perfect drug for that wiring. It gives you just enough pleasure to stay still, but not enough meaning to feel fulfilled. This is why many people fear success more than failure. Success brings comfort, and comfort demands maintenance, not rebellion. When you're struggling, you have a reason to fight. But when everything seems fine, you're given options. Button A or button B, red pill or blue. You feel empowered. And you're making your own decisions, charting your path, honing your destiny. This is freedom, right? The right to choose, the thrill of control. But what if the choice itself was designed? What if the options were curated to keep you looking in one direction, while the real game was happening elsewhere? That's the paradox. Choice creates illusion, because not all choices are real. Some are theater. Surface level options that distract from deeper structures you never got to vote on. You think you're in charge because you're picking between two pre-approved paths. But the box was built before you entered the room. The labels are different, but the walls remain the same. This illusion is everywhere. In politics, you're offered two parties, two brands, two ideologies, and the more they polarize, the more you're pulled into tribal loyalty. You feel like your vote matters, but the system, it stays intact. The machine keeps running, no matter who's behind the wheel. You're arguing about flavors, not ingredients. In consumer culture, you get thousands of choices. What to wear, what to eat, what to binge watch. But all the options live on the same shelves, controlled by the same algorithms, manufactured by the same conglomerates. You feel free because you're choosing, yet you're only choosing between curated cages. Psychologists call this the paradox of choice. The more options you're given, the more overwhelmed and dissatisfied you become. Because beneath the surface of choice lies a question you're not encouraged to ask. Who decided what I'm choosing from? In relationships, this illusion is even more subtle. You think you chose your partner, your friend, your tribe, but how much of that choice was pre-programmed? Family expectations, cultural scripts, childhood wounds, algorithms that told you who you're supposed to love, who you should trust, what traits you should value. You feel autonomous, but you're following invisible templates. Even your inner self plays the game. You say you're choosing to be kind, to be calm, to be productive, but often you're reacting to conditioning. Scripts you inherited, fears you absorbed, choices shaped by survival, not self-expression. You're not choosing, you're repeating. You finally reach peace. The shouting stops. The tension dissolves. There's quiet in the room and quiet in your chest. No more drama, no more battles, just stillness. But strangely, it doesn't last. Something stirs beneath the surface. A tremor, a tightening. Someone gets uncomfortable. Someone picks a fight. Sometimes that someone is you. That's the paradox. Peace triggers conflict because peace for many is unfamiliar, unnatural, even threatening. If you grew up in chaos, silence feels suspicious. If you're used to emotional turbulence, stillness feels fake. The body doesn't trust it. The mind doesn't believe it. So you stir the waters, you poke the bear. You light a small fire, not because you want destruction, but because discomfort feels more real than calm. This is how trauma survives. It reinterprets peace as danger. When you've lived too long in survival mode, the absence of conflict feels like a void. A silence your nervous system can't tolerate, and in that void, old patterns awaken. You overthink. You provoke. You sabotage. You manufacture conflict just to feel something familiar. You see this in relationships. A couple finally finds harmony. The arguments stop. The pressure lifts. And yet one of them starts a fight over nothing. A tone. A glance. A forgotten detail. It doesn't make sense until you realize that. Emotional peace can feel like emotional abandonment to someone who equates love with intensity. Psychologists refer to this as emotional homeostasis. Your brain and body are wired to maintain what they know, even if it's unhealthy. If you've only ever known high alert living, calm feels like emptiness. And the moment you feel peace, you unconsciously restore balance by reintroducing chaos. Not because you want pain, but because you need familiarity. This paradox is even more obvious in group dynamics. Families that claim they hate drama often recreate it the moment things feel too quiet. Institutions that preach harmony often introduce manufactured crises to keep control. Nations at peace eventually turn to new enemies, internal or external, to justify their identity. Because long-term peace threatens systems built on fear. Even in your own mind, peace can feel like a lie. You finally finish the project, resolve the argument, settle the debt. But instead of relief, you feel uneasy, restless, like something's missing. That's because you've been fueled by stress for so long. Peace creeps. You lock the door, double-check the windows. Keep your phone charged, your password strong, your secrets protected. You follow the rules, you obey the signs. You build your life around the idea of safety, physical, emotional, financial. You work hard to feel secure. But the safer things get, the more your mind begins to wander. What if? What next? What do I know? And suddenly the security you built becomes a source of anxiety. That's the paradox. Safety breeds paranoia, it doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly. The moment you feel safe, your mind begins looking for cracks. Because safety isn't just a condition, it's a vulnerability. Once you have something to lose, fear takes root. You stop worrying about survival and start worrying about preservation. You become obsessed not with what's broken, but with what might break. This is where paranoia begins, not in danger, but in the absence of it. Your nervous system, long accustomed to scanning for threats, refuses to shut down. So it invents new ones. You imagine betrayal from those who love you, You hear insult in neutral words. You feel watched even in solitude. You interpret silence as judgment, and all of it stems from one place, your desire to protect what you've built. Ironically, the more control you gain, the less peace you feel. You micromanage relationships, obsess over performance, question loyalty. You double-check what's already been secured, not because it's necessary, but because your safety has made you sensitive to anything that might shatter it. This is how people in power often become paranoid. Not because they're being attacked, but because they know how fragile their safety is. They understand how quickly admiration turns into criticism, how quickly loyalty shifts, how deeply one secret can undo a reputation. And so they begin to preempt betrayal. They surveil, they test, they isolate themselves. They control everyone around them, not to expand their power, but to preserve it. You see it in relationships too. The more secure the bond becomes, the more fear creeps in. What if they leave? What if they find someone better? The safety that once calmed you now exposes your fear of change, and you start reacting not to reality, but to imagined future loss. In psychology, this is related to hypervigilance, a state of heightened awareness. There's no shouting, no slamming doors, no threats hurled across the room, just quiet, controlled, tense. You speak and they don't respond. You cry and they blink. You ask what's wrong and they say nothing. But nothing is never nothing, because in that silence, something sharp is happening. It's the kind of violence that doesn't leave bruises, it leaves doubt. That's the paradox. Silence signals violence. We're taught that violence is loud, that it announces itself with fury and chaos. But the most chilling forms of harm often arrive silently, in withheld affection, in long pauses, in eyes that don't meet ears anymore, in the absence of sound that says more than words ever could. This kind of silence isn't neutral, it's tactical. It isolates, it punishes, it forces you to fill in the blanks with your own guilt. You wonder what you did wrong. You apologize without knowing why. You start negotiating with the silence, making yourself smaller, more careful, less inconvenient. In relationships, it's called the silent treatment, a classic form of emotional control. One person withdraws completely, not to reflect or heal, but to manipulate. Their silence becomes a weapon. A reminder, I control the temperature of this relationship. You either comply or freeze. This is a psychological phenomenon known as stonewalling, and it has profound effects. Studies show that prolonged silence can trigger anxiety, depression, and even physical symptoms in the person on the receiving end. Because humans are wired for connection, and when that connection disappears without explanation, the brain interprets it as danger. But the violence of silence doesn't stop at personal relationships. In woke places, silence becomes institutional. You report a problem, no response. You ask for support, no reply. Your concerns vanish into a void. And that void is not empty, it's full of quiet hostility. A clear message, you don't matter. Enough to answer. In social structures, silence is how injustice hides. People witness harm but say nothing. Organizations hear screams but stay quiet. And every time silence is chosen over truth, the violence spreads quietly, invisibly. Rules bring order. That's what we're told. Structure keeps us safe. Boundaries protect us. Systems ensure fairness. But the moment a rule is written, it creates something unexpected: resistance, loopholes, rebellion, decay. The very structure meant to contain chaos starts to feed it. The more rules you make, the more chaos you breed. That's the paradox. Rules invite chaos. It starts with a simple instruction. Don't touch the red button. It's meant to prevent disaster. But now, the red button holds power, mystery, temptation. Without the rule, you may never have noticed it. But now you want to touch it, not in spite of the rule, but because of it. This is the foundation of psychological reactance. A well-documented phenomenon where people push back simply because their freedom feels threatened. The moment you restrict someone, you activate their inner rebel. Not always consciously, but deeply, instinctually, they feel caged. And even if the rule makes sense, they find themselves testing it just to feel free again. You see this everywhere. In children, the more you forbid something, the more they want it. In adults, diets become obsessions. Legal restrictions fuel black markets. Censorship spreads forbidden ideas faster than any advertisement ever could. The rule creates the very chaos it was designed to prevent. This paradox plays out in institutions too. A company creates a policy to promote fairness. But over time, the policy becomes rigid. People start working around it. They exploit gray areas. They find ways to follow the rule in letter, but not in spirit. The system cracks not because it lacked rules, but because the rules became too many, too rigid, too disconnected from reality. The military teaches discipline through rules, but history shows us that overregulation breeds rebellion, secret disobedience, corruption hidden under layers of protocol. And when rules are enforced without understanding, they become absurd. Soldiers follow orders that make no sense, not because they're loyal, but because questioning them has been ruled out in religion. Moral codes are passed down to guide behavior. But over centuries, those codes multiply, tangle, contradict. And eventually the spirit of the teaching is buried beneath rituals, penalties, hierarchies. People forget why the rule existed. You understand them, you see their pain, their stress, their childhood, their trauma. You know what they've been through. So when they snap at you, you let it slide. When they lie, you justify it. When they hurt you, you forgive because you get it. You feel for them. And that's the paradox. Empathy enables cruelty. Empathy is supposed to be a virtue. It connects us, softens us, heals us. It's what allows you to say, I know how that feels. But empathy without boundaries becomes dangerous. Because once you step fully into someone else's pain, you start making excuses for their behavior. And slowly, without even realizing it, you start accepting what should never be accepted. This is how people stay in toxic relationships. Not because they're blind, but because they're empathetic. He's not a bad person. He's just broken. She's been through so much. It's not her fault. The more you understand someone, the harder it is to hold them accountable. And the more you forgive, the more space you give them to repeat the harm. This is especially common in abusive dynamics. Abusers often share their wounds with precision. They tell you about their past, the betrayal, the neglect, the pain. And in doing so, they create a trap. Because now, every time they hurt you, you're thinking about how they were hurt. You start to feel responsible for their healing. You stay, not because you're weak, but because you care. Psychologists refer to this as pathological altruism. When doing good for others ends up harming you. You over-empathize, you overextend, you rationalize things no one should rationalize. You forget that understanding someone's pain doesn't require tolerating their cruelty. It happens in friendships too. You keep forgiving the friend who always cancels, always gossips, always takes. You remind yourself they're going through something, and maybe they are. But that doesn't change the truth. Empathy is not a shield. It doesn't protect you from damage. Sometimes it delivers it. Even in social justice movements, this paradox plays out. People empathize with the anger of the oppressed. You give, you let go, you put others first. You carry the weight no one asked you to. You call it selflessness. You wear it like a badge. People admire your willingness to sacrifice. But over time, something strange happens. The very act of erasing yourself starts to make you feel important, necessary, even superior. And that's the paradox. Sacrifice reinforces ego. It sounds backwards. Sacrifice is supposed to be the absence of ego, the ultimate act of humility. But hidden inside many sacrifices is a craving, not for reward, but for meaning. You give something up, and in return you feel significant. You suffer and secretly believe it makes you better than those who didn't. This is the shadow side of self-denial. When your pain becomes a performance, when your exhaustion becomes an identity, you stop asking, is this needed? And start thinking, who would they be without me? You see this in families. The parent who sacrifices everything for their children then resents them for being ungrateful. The spouse who gives endlessly, only to hold it over the other's head during every argument. After everything I've done for you, they say, the sacrifice was real, but it wasn't clean. It came with strings made of guilt and power. This dynamic is deeply embedded in culture. Religions praise martyrdom. Woke places celebrate burnout. Movements glorify those who give everything, even their sanity, for the cause. But when you peel back the layers, you often find a central question behind the sacrifice. If I suffer more, do I matter more? Psychologists call this moral licensing, when people use good deeds as justification for toxic behavior. You give so much that you feel entitled to take. You suffer so deeply that you stop listening. You place yourself on a pedestal, not in spite of your sacrifice, but because of it. And the ego loves this version of virtue. It turns your pain into power. It tells you, look how much better you are than the ones who stayed comfortable. You start to see yourself as the anchor, the backbone, the savior. And before long, your sacrifice becomes your throne. But here's the truth. Not all sacrifice is love. Some of it is control. A way to stay needed. A way to maintain moral leverage. A way to hide from your own desires by living through someone else's dot in relationships. You're amazing. No one does it like you. I don't know what I'd do without you. It sounds sweet, warm, admiring, and it might be. But sometimes flattery isn't a compliment, it's a collar. It doesn't lift you up. It traps you. It shapes your behavior, keeps you in place, makes you afraid to fall short of the pedestal you were never meant to be on. That's the paradox. Flattery masks control, because not all praise is pure. Some is designed, carefully measured, spoken at just the right moment to bend you, not break you. Flattery can feel like love, but operate like strategy. And the more you enjoy hearing it, the more power it holds over you. At first, it feels innocent, encouraging, but as the compliments build, so does the pressure. You become the strong one, so you can't show weakness. You're the reliable one, so you can't say no. You're the best, so you can't stop. You become a role they've written for you, and slowly you start acting in it, afraid to disappoint the image they projected. This happens often in woke places. A manager tells you you're the heart of the team. They praise your work ethic. They say you're indispensable. And before you know it, you're working longer hours, skipping breaks, and picking up slack because you don't want to let them down. It doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like pride. But your sense of worth has been tethered to being who they need you to be. In relationships, flattery can be the most seductive tool of control. A partner showers you with affection so much that you mistake it for intimacy. They tell you no one could love you like they do. And at first it feels empowering, but over time it becomes isolating. You begin to fear life without their approval. You make choices not based on truth, but on maintaining that glow of admiration. Psychologically, this links to intermittent reinforcement when positive feedback is used unpredictably to condition behavior. A compliment here. A cold shoulder. There, it's just enough praise to keep you hooked, but not enough to feel secure. You work harder for their validation, chasing the next hit of flattery like a drug. Even in friendships, this shows up. You're the funny one, the listener, the therapist. Your identity becomes the source of someone else's comfort. And because they tell you how special you are, you hesitate to set boundaries. You confuse their admiration with care, not realize, hold on, just a little longer. Things will get better. This isn't the end. Don't give up. These are the words we clutch when we're drowning. They sound beautiful, noble, human, and sometimes they save us. But sometimes they don't. Sometimes hope doesn't pull you forward. It holds you hostage. Sometimes it's not a light in the dark. It's a chain that keeps you waiting in it. That's the paradox. Hope extends suffering. Hope keeps you still, quiet, patient. It tells you not to leave yet, not to quit yet, not to speak up, not to let go. Because maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe they'll change. Maybe this time things will finally work out. And so you stay, you endure. You shrink, not because you're weak, but because you believe. This is where hope becomes a form of psychological warfare. Not from outside, from within. You convince yourself that pain has meaning, that your endurance is virtue, that letting go would be failure. And so the abuse continues. The job drains you. The relationship erodes you. The goal that once gave your life direction becomes a prison you're too proud to walk away from. Because what happens if you stop hoping? Who are you without the dream? What if this was all for nothing? That's the real cruelty of hope. It becomes the reason you keep accepting what hurts you. You see this in toxic relationships. Someone lies, cheats, disappears, but every time, they promise they'll change. And you believe them. Not because they've changed, but because you're invested. You've already waited so long. And now hope isn't about them anymore. It's about protecting your own past. The longer you hope, the more you need that hope to be justified. And the more pain you'll endure to make it so. This is what psychologists call sunk cost fallacy. When you stay in something simply because you've already given it so much. Hope keeps the illusion alive. That if you just try a little harder, hold on a little longer, one day you'll be glad you didn't walk away. But that day never comes. Or if it does, it comes at the cost of years, your voice, your joy, your health, and systems. This dynamic is everywhere. Citizens hope their government will improve. Workers hope their company will finally value them. You let it go. You breathe. You say the words, I forgive you. And just like that, the weight begins to lift. The wound doesn't sting the same. You're not doing it for them. You tell yourself you're doing it for your peace, your healing, your freedom. But somewhere beneath the grace and maturity, a second voice whispers, they never really face what they did. And just like that, you've stepped into the paradox. Forgiveness justifies abuse. Not always. Not in its purest form. But in practice, forgiveness is often weaponized. Not by the wounded, but by the abuser. Because once forgiveness is granted, the slate feels clean. The guilt fades. The consequences vanish. And the cycle begins again. You see this in toxic relationships. One person crosses the line, yells, cheats, lies, vanishes. They cry. They apologize. They say they've changed. And because you love them, or because you've been trained to value forgiveness over boundaries, you forgive. And the next time they do it, you forgive again and again and again until your forgiveness becomes a guarantee, not a gift. Forgiveness becomes a loophole, a way for people to avoid accountability while keeping access. I said I was sorry. What more do you want? Becomes the refrain. And if you hesitate to forgive, suddenly you become the problem. You're holding a grudge. You're being toxic. You're refusing to heal. This is where the warfare begins, because now your pain is being used against you. The more you hurt, the more pressure you feel to be the bigger person. You're told to move on, to let it go, to stop living in the past. But the past hasn't ended. It's just being rebranded. And if you're someone who values empathy, you're even more vulnerable to this trap. You understand why they did it. You know their backstory, their wounds. You rationalize their behavior through compassion. And slowly, without even realizing it, you begin to erase yourself in the name of understanding them. Psychologists call this toxic forgiveness, when you forgive not because it's time, but because you're afraid of what it would mean if you didn't. You don't want to be seen as bitter. You don't want to start. You hear the facts. You read the statements. You see the evidence lined up, clear and undeniable. No lies, no secrets. Everything seems transparent, even noble. They're telling the truth, so how could anything be wrong? But that's exactly the trick. The truth is being used to hide what you're not supposed to notice. The truth becomes a distraction, a decoy, a shield. That's the paradox. Truth shields deception, because the best lies are never built on falsehoods alone. They're built on selective truth, on timing, on emphasis. The whole story is never hidden, just carefully arranged so that your focus lands where they want it. And you trust what you see because it's technically real. This is the genius of psychological manipulation. If someone lies outright, your defenses rise. But if they give you truth in pieces enough to earn your trust, you lower your guard. And once your guard is down, they don't need to lie. They just need to omit. This tactic is everywhere. In politics, leaders admit to small failures to appear honest while burying deeper scandals in bureaucracy. In companies, a carefully worded press release takes responsibility for miscommunication while avoiding the word fraud. In personal relationship, someone tells you everything they did do, just not the one thing they did, and single quotes, T.truth is used like a mirror held at the perfect angle. You see what you're meant to see, and nothing more. This is what psychologists call impression management, a strategy where people use truth selectively to curate how they are perceived. It's not just about lying, it's about framing. You hear the details that sound accountable. You miss the ones that would change everything. Even more insidious is when people weaponize truth against you. They say, "You knew what this was?" Or, "I never promised you anything." They're technically right. But the tone, the implications, the silence between their words all suggested something more. And now they use your memory against you. Because truth in isolation becomes a tool of denial. This is how abusers justify themselves. "I never touched you. I never said those words." You stay composed. You don't react. You keep your tone low, your face neutral, your voice steady. You take pride in being the calm one, the rock, the stable presence in the storm. People respect it. They come to you, they lean on you, and slowly, they begin to fall apart in your silence because your calm meant to prevent chaos starts inviting it instead. That's the paradox. Calm encouraged chaos, not because calm is wrong, but because when it becomes your identity, it creates a vacuum when others rush to fill. You're calm while others panic. You absorb. You de-escalate, you explain. And over time, the people around you stop regulating themselves. They stop managing their outbursts. They rely on you to hold the balance, and they know you will. You always do. This is how quiet people become chaos magnets. Their stillness creates space for others' storms. Their patience enables tantrums. Their groundedness becomes the excuse for others to spiral because you can handle it. And you do until one day you can't. You snap, or break, or vanish, and no one sees it coming because your calm made them believe you had no limit. You were unshakable, unbreakable. And when you finally fall, they look at you like you betrayed them. Psychologists call this emotional labor, the unseen work of managing not only your own emotions, but everyone else's. 2, you become the emotional container, the regulator, the shock absorber. And as long as you're calm, no one else feels the need to change. This dynamic shows up everywhere. In families, one sibling is the peacemaker, so the others stay loud, reactive, dramatic. In relationships, one partner is always composed, so the other becomes careless with words, lazy with effort, explosive with anger. The calm person carries the emotional maturity. And the more they carry, the less others feel they need to grow. You see this in leadership too. A calm boss becomes the reason a toxic team never confronts its dysfunction. A quiet CEO becomes the shield behind which chaos festers. Calm is you tighten your grip, you make the plan. You double check, micromanage, organize every detail. You prepare for every possibility. Nothing happens without your say. You feel responsible, safe, strong, in control. But every time freedom knocks, spontaneity, unpredictability, surrender, you flinch, you freeze, you push it away. That's the paradox. Control fears freedom, because control isn't just a behavior, it's a defense. A way to keep life manageable. People predictable and outcomes engineered. And the more control you gain, the more anxious you become at the thought of losing it. This isn't about power, it's about fear. A quiet, persistent fear that without control, things will fall apart. People will leave. You'll fail. You'll be humiliated. You'll get hurt. And so you overcorrect. You build walls. You set rules. You plan every move. You call it discipline, maturity, leadership. But inside you're scared. Not of chaos, but of the unknown. Because freedom is uncontrollable. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't offer guarantees. It arrives wild, unscheduled, and unrehearsed. And to the person who lives by control, that kind of freedom feels like death. You see this in relationships. One partner wants freedom to grow, to explore, to be messy. The other tightens the reins, not to harm, but to protect. Where are you going? Why didn't you text? Let's just stay in. It sounds like love. But really, it's fear masquerading as care. Eventually, the free one starts to suffocate. And the controller, sensing distance, tightens. Further, they become more attentive, more helpful, more strategic. But the more they try to secure the connection, the faster it dies. Because freedom is oxygen. And control, no matter how soft, always reduces airflow. This dynamic lives in parenting too. You're safe. The doors are locked. The rules are clear. The schedule is set. The world around you is padded with protection policies, guidelines, fences, passwords, consequences. It feels stable, structured, secure. But then one day you realize you can't move without asking. You can't speak without checking. You can't breathe without wondering if it's allowed. And that's when it hits you. Security disguises oppression. Because the need to feel safe often becomes the justification for control. Control becomes policy. Policy becomes culture. And culture becomes something you don't question because questioning it makes you dangerous. Or worse, ungrateful. This is how societies are built. Laws are passed for your safety. Cameras are installed for your protection. Freedoms are limited for the greater good. And little by little, the world becomes tighter, cleaner, quieter. But beneath that silence is a thick layer of fear. You fear the consequence of stepping out of line. You fear being watched, being labeled, being punished not for what you've done, but for what you might do. And suddenly security doesn't feel like a shield. It feels like a leash. This is the machinery of soft oppression. It doesn't beat you into submission. It lulls you with comfort, with order, with a story that says, we're doing this for you. And the more comfortable you get, the harder it is to recognize that your choices have shrunk. This happens in relationships too. The partner who controls your schedule, your wardrobe, your circle, always framed as caring. They just want to keep you safe. They just want what's best. They don't trust the world around you, so they cage you in velvet. And by the time you realize you've been contained, you've forgotten what it feels like to choose freely. Even parenting isn't immune. A child raised in constant structure, no risk, no failure, no mistakes allowed, might grow up obedient. Even successful, but also terrified of doing it wrong, of disappointing someone, of existing without approval, because when safety is enforced by fear, it's no longer protection. You've seen them now, the silent weapons, the invisible traps. The paradox is hiding beneath what you were taught to trust: kindness, structure, safety, love. You didn't imagine them. They were always there. You were just trained not to notice because psychological warfare isn't about breaking bones. It's about bending perception. It's not about taking control. It's about making you hand it over voluntarily. Through kindness that becomes control. Through rules that invite rebellion. Through freedom that demands obedience. Through peace that slowly feels like a lie. It's not always malicious. It's often routine, polite, socialized, passed down, dressed in good intentions and strategic silences. But the damage is the same. You shrink, you doubt, you obey, and you thank the system for letting you stay. That's the genius of it. You mistake survival for morality. You confuse fear for love. You call obedience maturity, and by the time you realize you've been shaped, It's hard to find the edges of who you used to be, but now you've seen the paradoxes. And once you see them, they start showing up everywhere in conversations, in decisions, in the subtle tug between your instincts and your habits. And the question that follows is always the same. Do you want to wake up? Because waking up means discomfort. It means saying no to flattery, questioning praise, seeing through peace that silences you, letting go of the identity that obedience gave you. It means giving up comfort in exchange for clarity, but clarity is worth it. Not because it fixes everything, but because it returns your mind to you. And in a world that runs on invisible scripts, owning your mind is the ultimate rebellion. So take what you've learned here and begin again. Rethink your loyalty. Reclaim your truth. Speak even when it trembles. Ask questions even when they frown. Because this war isn't fought with fists. It's fought with silence and politeness. And praise. And the only way to win is to see it and refuse to play.